I was 34 years old when my mother looked at the guest book from my husband's funeral and said the words that changed everything. "Well," she said, turning a page like she was flipping through a coupon circular, "I suppose it was a nice enough gathering, though I wouldn't call it anything but trivial." Trivial. That was the word she used. Not sad. Not difficult. Trivial. I was a paralegal, which means I spent my working life reading what people said and comparing it to what they signed. I knew the difference between spoken words and documented intent. I knew the weight of language. And I knew in that moment that my mother had just said something so perfectly, utterly revealing that no amount of apology later would ever take it back. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where people who keep quiet keep the receipts, and family learns that boundaries have a cost. If you've ever watched someone dismiss the sacred and then act shocked when you stopped offering them a seat at your table, you're in the right place. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's talk about what happens when you stop calling people family just because they share your blood. My husband Marcus died on a Tuesday in March. He was 41. He was a teacher, high school English, the kind of man who wrote comments on papers no one asked him to write, the kind who showed up. We had been married for 7 years. We didn't have children. We had a house, a dog, a garden where he grew tomatoes he'd give away to neighbors. He had a will. He had instructions about what he wanted when he was gone. I know because I helped him draft it. I had been a paralegal for 9 years at that point. My specialty was estate work, wills, trusts, probate, the architecture of what people leave behind. It meant I saw families from the inside. I saw what people told themselves mattered and what they'd actually put in writing. There's always a gap between the two. Always. I'd learned early that people's mouths will lie to you every time. But documents don't lie. Documents don't forget. Documents don't get tired of being right. My family was my parents, Margaret and David, and my brother Christopher, who lived 3 hours away and called on major holidays. My parents had been skeptical of Marcus from the beginning. Not openly. They were too practiced for that. It was the kind of skepticism that lived in small choices. Invitations that arrived late, conversations that ended when I entered a room, support that was always somewhere else the week we needed it. They had built a life around the idea that I would eventually come back to them, the actual people I was blood related to, and abandon the decision I'd made to build something with someone else. When Marcus got sick, it took 3 weeks to get a diagnosis and another week to understand what the diagnosis meant. He was in the hospital for 12 days. I called my parents each morning. My mother asked practical questions about parking and visiting hours. My father asked once how Marcus was doing and then never asked again. Christopher sent flowers. That was all. I understood by the time Marcus died that his dying was happening to me, not to them. I had already moved beyond their world into a smaller, more necessary one. The funeral was 9 days after his death. I organized it the way Marcus had asked. A service in the afternoon, people speaking, a burial the following morning. The guest book filled with pages. His colleagues came. His students came. Neighbors came. I wore a gray dress because Marcus once said he liked gray on me, that it made me look like someone who knew her own mind. I spoke for 5 minutes about something he said to me, the last real conversation we had. I don't remember what it was. I only remember standing there, speaking carefully, the way I'd been taught to speak, saying the words, not the feeling. My parents sat in the second row. My mother wore navy blue. My father held a program in both hands the entire service, as if it might change the outcome. Afterward, people came to the house. It was March and the kitchen was too warm. I kept moving through it, accepting casseroles and condolences, the words blurring together into a background hum I could ignore by staying in motion. The next morning at the graveside, there were 47 people. I know because I kept count. I was standing alone, and counting was what I did when I didn't know what else to do. 47 people had shown up before sunrise on a cold morning in March to say goodbye to a man who had mattered to them. That number meant something. I would return to that number later and be grateful for it the way you're grateful for evidence. My parents stood across from me, separated by the grave. My mother held a tissue she didn't use. My father looked at the sky. When it was over and people were leaving, my mother came to me and held my arm too long, The way she held things when she was afraid they'd fly away. She didn't say anything about Marcus. She said, "We'll have you over for dinner next month. You shouldn't be alone right now." I said yes to be polite. The word yes came out like I was reading it from somewhere outside myself. If you know what it's like to have people in your life who show up for the funeral but never showed up for the marriage, you understand this next part. Stay with me. The will was supposed to be straightforward. Marcus had updated it 2 years before he died, and we had walked through it together. The house was mine. His retirement accounts went into a trust that would pay out small amounts over time. I never needed it, but he wanted me to have it. His personal effects, his books, his clothes, the things that had been in his life for decades, he left to specific people. His teacher notebooks went to the school where he worked so they could preserve them. His watch went to my brother. He and Marcus had been close in that quiet way men can be. His wedding ring was to be buried with him, which it was. And there was a clause about his funeral. It specified that the service was to be conducted according to the wishes of his wife, and that any objections to the manner of his death care were to be addressed to me and not acted upon by anyone else. I didn't think about the clause much at the time. It was legal boilerplate, the kind of thing I wrote into wills once a week. It wasn't until March 22nd, 3 weeks after the funeral, that I understood why Marcus had written it. The call came from my father's financial advisor, a man named Richard Brenner who had been managing my parents' money for 15 years. He asked if I had a moment to talk privately. I was at work at my desk with a client file open in front of me. I closed the file and waited. "Your father asked me to reach out," Richard said. His voice was careful, the kind careful that means someone is about to say something they know the person they're saying it to won't want to hear. "He wanted me to advise you on some of the costs related to Marcus's funeral. He'd like to discuss a reimbursement arrangement." I didn't speak. I waited for the rest. "Your parents are on a fixed income," Richard continued. "Your father mentioned that your mother made a generous contribution to the flowers and the reception after the service. He thought it might be appropriate for you to offset that cost, particularly since Marcus's estate is presumably substantial. The thing about being a paralegal is that you learn to hear the real sentence underneath the one someone is speaking. What he was really saying was, your father sent me to extract money from you on the grounds that your mother bought some flowers for a funeral she considered trivial. How much? I asked. Your mother wasn't specific. Your father thought you might offer an amount. I heard myself say, I'll review the receipts and get back to you. Professional. Neutral. The voice I used in depositions. But I was already documenting it. While I was still on the call, I pulled up my email and opened a new message to myself with the date, the time, Richard's exact words written out the way I would write them in a legal memo. Not because I knew yet what I would do with the information, but because, and this is the part the prompt got right, once you know someone is going to lie to you, you start keeping the receipts. I called my parents that evening. I asked to speak to both of them on the phone at the same time. My mother asked why, in the tone of someone who was already performing surprise at the question. I got a call from Richard Brenner, I said. He said you wanted reimbursement for the flowers at the funeral. The silence that followed had shape to it. It had weight. We didn't ask for reimbursement, my father said finally. Richard suggested we might discuss costs with you. What costs exactly? The reception, my mother said. We didn't expect you to provide that. We thought. I didn't provide it. I paid for it myself. Well. Another silence. My mother's voice came back smaller. Richard said your estate was substantial. There it was. Not concerned for me. Not checking in. Not even admitting they were uncomfortable. Just the assumption, spoken as a whisper, that my dead husband's money was money they might be entitled to access if they framed the request correctly. I said, I'll send Richard an itemized breakdown of all funeral costs. I'll note which items my parents contributed to and which items I paid for. If you'd like reimbursement for your items, you'll have to dispute the invoice. Otherwise, we can consider this closed. I hung up after that. Not angry. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt the way you feel when you place a document in front of you and read it 3 times to make sure you understood what it actually said. That night, I requested all the records from the funeral home. I asked for itemized invoices, receipts, a breakdown of every charge. It took 2 business days. When they arrived, I printed them out and read them in order, the way you're supposed to read evidence. The flowers my mother had bought without being asked and had somehow transformed into a debt I owed, came to $247. The florist's receipt was dated March 10th, the day of the service. My mother hadn't asked me if she should buy them. She hadn't offered to pay for them herself. She had bought them knowing that later she might frame it as a gift I should repay. I put that receipt in a folder. I added Richard's email. I added the transcript of my conversation with my parents, written out word for word as I remembered it, dated and timed. I didn't know yet what I was building. But I was building something. I could feel it starting. The real evidence came 2 weeks later. And it wasn't about the flowers. I had asked the funeral home to send me the guest book from the service. I wasn't sure if they could do that, but they did, without question. It arrived in a box with a protective sleeve, the binding still new. I opened it on a Saturday afternoon, alone in the house. Marcus was still everywhere. His books on the shelf, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his shoes by the door. The guest book was one more thing of his that I was responsible for. I read the first page slowly. A teacher's handwriting, shaky with emotion. A note about how Marcus had changed someone's life. The next page was a student, someone who wrote about how Mr. Chan had told her to keep writing even when she was afraid. Page after page of people saying goodbye to someone who had mattered to them. By the time I reached the center of the book, I was reading and rereading the same entries, looking for the patterns. The people who came had been specific and generous. They had said exact things. They had remembered exact moments. And then I found it. Page 47. Not the 47 people at the graveside, though that synchronicity made my breath catch. Page 47 contained 2 entries. The first was from a woman named Helen, who taught with Marcus and wrote a paragraph about his kindness. The second entry was in my mother's handwriting. I can still see it exactly. The ink was blue. The handwriting was her careful, controlled script, the same script she'd used to write checks and sign permission slips my entire life. She had written, "A life measured in small moments. He'll be remembered for the good times they shared." But Margaret signed. Not Margaret and David. Not Margaret, concerned mother. Not Margaret, grieving the loss of her daughter's husband. Just Margaret, remembering him for the good times. Not his goodness, not his character, but the good times, as if he were a movie she'd watched, something that had passed pleasantly and could be filed away. But there was something else. A note in the same handwriting on the same page in the margin. It was the kind of thing people do when they've written what they're supposed to write and then add the thing they actually think. It said, "Though we'll see how she manages on her own." I read that line 17 times. I printed out a photo of the page. I didn't know yet why I was doing it, but I was building something and this page was its foundation. It wasn't a confession. It was something quieter and more damning. It was the proof that my mother had shown up at her son-in-law's funeral, written in a guest book that was meant to be a record of people's love and loss, and used it as an opportunity to document her assessment of my future vulnerability. I closed the guest book and held it in my lap for an hour without moving. The dog came and rested her head on my leg. Outside it was March still, and nothing had changed except everything. My parents called a week later. My mother's voice was different. It had that musical quality it always got when she was about to offer me something she believed I needed. "We've been thinking," she said, "about your situation." I didn't ask what situation she meant. I waited. "We'd like you to come to the house this Sunday. We're having some family and friends over for brunch. It would be good for you to be around people. You shouldn't isolate." I said yes. The email came an hour later from Richard Brenner. He wrote that my parents were planning an estate discussion as part of the brunch. They wanted to go over what I might expect to inherit from them eventually, and in the meantime they wanted to discuss what they could do to help with my finances. He noted that they were concerned about my ability to manage the household alone. I printed the email. I added it to the folder. By that point the folder was 2 inches thick. I arrived at my parents' house at 11 o'clock on Sunday. They lived in the same house they'd bought when I was 2 years old. A place so familiar that walking through it felt like walking through a memory of myself. The dining room table was set with the china they saved for occasions. There were 8 other people there, mostly people my parents had known for decades. A retired teacher. A couple who owned a business. Richard Brenner was there too, positioned at the corner of the table in a way that made it clear he wasn't there as a guest. My mother hugged me for too long. My father stood and shook my hand formally, the way he always had when I came home, as if I were a guest who needed proper etiquette. We sat. We ate quiche and fruit and pastries. The other people made small talk with me about Marcus, the kind of small talk where they were clearly reading from a script about how to talk to widows. I answered in monosyllables and turned my attention to my plate. After brunch, my mother excused herself and then returned with my father. They looked at each other in a way that suggested they had discussed the next part carefully. "We wanted to talk to you about some changes we think you should make," my mother said. She folded her hands in front of her on the table. "Your father and I are concerned that you're not equipped to manage a household on your own. We think you should consider renting your house and moving into something smaller, more manageable. And," my father added, "we think you might benefit from our financial guidance. Richard has some suggestions." Richard pulled out a document from a briefcase beside his chair. I could see it was some kind of property analysis, a suggestion that my house was worth more than I should be living in, a recommendation that I downsize and put the proceeds into an account he would manage. I looked at the document in front of Richard. I didn't touch it. And then I asked one question, the kind of question I had learned in my paralegal training you ask when you want to see what someone will say when they're cornered. "Did Marcus ever discuss his concerns about his relationship with you?" The table went quiet. "He felt," my mother began carefully, "that we could have been more supportive of your marriage." "When did he discuss that with you?" No one answered. "Did he mention it?" I continued. "During the 3 weeks he was in the hospital?" My father shifted in his chair. "Because I was there during those 3 weeks. I kept a record of who called, who visited, who asked about him in that time period. I have that record. I didn't pull it out. I didn't need to. I could see the moment my parents understood that I was no longer the daughter who moved quietly through their world and absorbed their disappointment. I was the woman who kept receipts. I excused myself and stepped outside to call my attorney. The letters arrived 5 business days later. One addressed to my parents, one addressed to Richard Brenner. They were formal documents, cease and desist orders regarding any further advice to me about my finances, property, or estate. They detailed every conversation, every implied pressure, every assumption that my dead husband's assets belonged in a category they could help themselves to. My attorney had written them in clean, declarative language. There was no anger in them. There was only documentation and consequence. I waited to hear back. It took 10 days. My mother called me late on a Thursday evening. She had been crying. I could hear it in her voice, the thickness of it, the way it came in stops and starts. "We received a letter," she said. "Yes." "From your lawyer." "Yes." "We would never," she said, and her voice broke. "We would never hurt you intentionally. I let the silence do the work. We made mistakes," she continued. "About Marcus. About how we treated you. But this is extreme." "Is it?" I said. "Is it extreme to ask people to stop treating me like I'm a debt they're owed?" She didn't answer. "I'd like you to call me only when you have something to say that is true," I said. "No assumptions. No plans for my life. No conversations with financial advisors about my estate. When you're ready to have that conversation with me directly, and honestly, I'll listen. Until then, I think we should take a break." I hung up. I didn't feel victorious. I felt precise, like I had performed a small surgery with the right instruments and now I was closing the wound. 3 weeks later, they asked to see me. I said no. A month after that, they asked again. I said I would meet them in a public place at a coffee shop downtown Neutral Ground. I prepared a file and brought it with me. They looked different than they had at the brunch. Smaller somehow, or maybe just less sure of themselves. My mother ordered tea and didn't drink it. My father ordered coffee and held the cup without bringing it to his lips. "We don't understand what we did that was so wrong," my mother said. And I could hear in that statement the core of everything. They genuinely didn't understand. Not because they were stupid, but because they had spent so long moving through the world with the assumption that their intentions were enough. They had assumed that showing up to Marcus's funeral was a gift, not an obligation. They had assumed that buying flowers without being asked and then implying I owed them for it was normal. They had assumed that my vulnerability after loss was an opportunity. I opened the folder. I didn't hand it to them. I laid it on the table between us and opened it, page by page, the way a lawyer presents evidence. The emails. The phone records I had documented. The guest book page with the margin note. The funeral invoice. The property analysis Richard had prepared. The letters from my attorney. I didn't speak while they looked. I let them read. When they finished, I closed the folder and took it back. "These are documents," I said. "They show what happened and in what order." I kept them because when I talked to my therapist about this, I want her to have evidence that I'm not misremembering. I want to know that I'm not crazy. I want to have proof that my parents, the people who raised me, decided that my grief was an opening. My mother reached across the table to touch my hand. I moved it away. "Don't," I said. "Not yet." I left the coffee shop before they did. I didn't look back. That was 3 years ago. A lot has changed since then. My parents wrote me an actual letter 6 months after that coffee shop meeting. Not an email, a handwritten letter, which my mother had clearly agonized over, the handwriting pressing through the paper. She apologized without excusing. She didn't claim that they'd been misunderstood, or that I'd been oversensitive. She said specific to each action what she and my father had done and why it was wrong. She said she understood if I wasn't ready to rebuild a relationship with them. She said she would wait. I didn't respond for 2 months. When I did, I agreed to see them once a month, always in public, always bounded. It's not what we had before. It's something different now, more honest, less automatic, built on the understanding that love is not a license to assume you know what's good for someone else. My brother called me during that time, after he heard what happened. He apologized for not knowing. He didn't know because I hadn't told him, and because my parents, in their way, had kept the betrayal small enough not to be visible from the outside. We talk more now. He's the person Marcus would have wanted in my life. The house is still mine. I never considered selling it. Marcus's things are still here. His books are still on the shelf, his wedding ring is still in the drawer where we keep important papers, his handwriting is still in the margins of textbooks. I don't need to get rid of them. Living with them is not painful anymore. It's just living. The guest book sits on my nightstand. I don't read it every day. But I reread that one page sometimes, Helen's entry about Marcus's kindness, and my mother's notation below it about how she'd see how I managed on my own. The entry next to my mother's is from a student Marcus had never taught. The student had come to the funeral because Marcus had changed their life. The student wrote, "He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." I'll carry that forward. That's what the page actually says when you read all of it. That's what it shows. Not my mother's assessment of my future vulnerability, but the overwhelming evidence of a man who mattered, documented in the handwriting of people he had actually changed. And that's the thing about keeping receipts. You get to see the full picture. You get to see not just where people failed you but where they showed up. You get to know the difference. I used the money that would have gone to Richard Brenner's investment accounts to set up a scholarship in Marcus's name at the high school where he taught. It's for students who don't have anyone cheering them on, who have to believe in themselves because their families won't do it for them. Every year, a student gets Marcus's money, and a student gets to stay in school because someone somewhere decided to put his resources toward someone he didn't have to help. That's not revenge. That's not even justice. That's just doing what Marcus would have done. That's just honoring the arithmetic he understood, the one my parents never quite learned. That people matter because they matter, not because they'll be grateful, not because you can extract something from it later. They matter. And when you lose them, you remember them by moving that thing they understood forward into the world. If you've ever been told that you were dramatic for protecting yourself from people you were supposed to love, If you've ever kept documentation just to prove you weren't crazy, if you've ever had to choose between your blood and your peace, take that as your sign. Your boundaries are allowed. Your caution is valid. Your receipts are proof. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and remember, quiet people keep the receipts, and family is a decision you get to renew or revoke. I'll see you in the next one.